Sarah Court. Lectures will be held once a month until this October, and a special discussion will be held in November. For a more communicative, inclusive, and sustainable World Heritage interpretation and presentation, we need your active cooperation. So, come and join the lectures and leave your opinions and questions on the lecture and World Heritage issues on our live streaming videos. On the online lecture series, we have time for questions after the lectures. Now, before we start today's lecture, I would like to introduce our lecturer, Dr. Sarah Court. Sarah Court is an archaeologist and heritage practitioner who is preliminarily concerned with the relationships between heritage and society, participatory approaches, and interpretation. Her professional practice is mainly based at heritage places in Italy and beyond, and has been strongly influenced by over a decade of involvement with the Herculaneum conservation project in Italy. At Herculaneum, she coordinated initiatives that promoted participatory approaches to cultural heritage in order to improve management strategies and obtain heritage benefits for the local community. In addition to providing support to heritage authorities responsible for World Heritage properties, in particular with regard to heritage impact assessment and management planning, she is increasingly involved in international capacity building and guidance for the sector. Her consultancy work for ICRAM began with the program on the people-centered approaches to conservation, and she is now the lead author of impact assessment guidance within the framework of the World Heritage Leadership Program. Her work on interpretation is rooted in an MSc in Interpretation, Management and Practice. She is currently involved in a project by the UNESCO Regional Bureau for Science and Culture in Europe to provide capacity building in interpretation for World Heritage Site Management teams. In addition, she is the coordinator of ICIP for ICOMOS Italy. Now, let's start today's lecture. A great pleasure to meet you, Sarah.
Today. I'd first of all obviously like to thank WHIPIC for having invited me to join the lecture series. It's a real honour to be included amongst those names you've just heard. So today we are going to be thinking about the subject of community and how they can be involved. Practice, often left until or if we have time to deal with it. But I'd like to perhaps suggest today that when we do work with communities, or perhaps when we just let the communities lead the way, there are real benefits for everyone, for the communities themselves, for the heritage, and for us as practitioners. So if we are practicing interpretation in a very inclusive way, we can potentially contribute to a number of wide-ranging heritage and conservation goals. Now, I'm assuming that you're listening today because you already have an interest in this subject. You're working with communities already, or you might be planning to do so. So as we go today, I would find it really useful if you would be sharing your own experiences in the chat. Because I think there's a lot we can learn from existing work. I will be sharing a couple of case studies from my experience in Italy, but I think we can really benefit if we get a wider global perspective, which is where all of you watching today can contribute. Because we're often stuck in theoretical debates about communities, yes or no, and I think we do well to bring strong examples to the discussion, because that's how we're going to learn and move our practice forward. And And perhaps as we, as a global community, discuss this in greater detail, we'll see how much common ground we share. So I very much look forward to hearing your own experiences today. But let us start. So the general issue of involving communities in heritage is actually one that is regularly discussed and has been for some time. There are a range of publications, there are many more that you'll be familiar with. And I just think for a minute, though, we would benefit from looking at this broader debate and reminding ourselves that interpretation is just one activity in this bigger picture of caring for world heritage. And then we'll come back and see how specifically interpretation can deal with things. And I think it's important in this conversation to start with a clear acknowledgement about cultural heritage and the fact that it is actually the product of communities. We rarely have heritage produced by an individual. Our cultural heritage has been created by groups of people and has been created usually for the benefit of those people. So we actually do our society a great disservice when we have decided in many heritage institutions to create some sort of separation between communities and their heritage. In light of the fact that there's now a lot of research that's showing just how fundamental culture and our cultural heritage is to us as a species. Human beings have evolved with culture. It is part of who we are. And of course, World Heritage also encompasses natural heritage. And despite living in the 21st century with all our technology, we are entirely dependent as humans on our natural resources for our survival. But there is so much more. I think this how important nature is for our experience, for our well-being, particularly when so many people were cut off from nature during a lockdown. It's highlighting how dangerous it is when our practices at heritage places involve separating people. I would like to recognise that it is usually the heritage practitioners themselves who make this division between cultural heritage. We talk to communities, there is rarely a difference between the two. They are on a spectrum perhaps, but all very interrelated. So these are just some examples of world heritage that illustrate that very clearly. We do well to remember that perspective, that these two are not divided. But as we speak about communities, I don't want to take a naive view of what people are and can be. I think we do need to recognise that heritage in the modern world is under increasing pressure. There are many problems that we're facing, and most of these are actually coming from people, caused by people. The problem, perhaps, though, is that as a sector, our reaction to those problems for much of the 20th century was a professionalisation of the heritage sector. Particularly in the Western world, the trend over the last century has been to build fences around heritage. Instead of protecting the heritage for people, we started to protect the heritage from people. Not just keeping people out, but in extreme cases, even removing the people who lived there. And the idea was that we save these little islands, these special heritage places, and the rest of the world will slowly deteriorate around, but we've got our little safe place. Now, I'd like to tie these comments back into what my colleague, Dr. 𝐂𝐨𝐦𝐦𝐻𝐸 was talking about in the first WHIPIC lecture series. He spoke on this very eloquently, and I know you can go back and review his lecture on the YouTube channel. He showed this slide and explained how, for so long, this has been the focus of the heritage sector, that we're looking at the physical fabric of heritage, and the ultimate goal is simply caring for that heritage. And conventional management systems were created to look a little bit like this. There is some heritage which is managed, and maybe the local community might be taken into consideration sometimes. What's the problem with this? Well, in actual fact, it was all a little bit too tidy, and reality is not so tidy. If we think about World Heritage properties today, we recognise that life is more complicated. There are people living in historic town centres. They worship actively in monuments. They farm agricultural landscapes. People are carrying out sacred practices in protected natural areas. Now, our sector might not have wanted to recognise this, but keeping communities away has not proved possible in a lot of cases, nor successful. What we've ended up with is our model of the safe island hasn't worked. Instead, we're finding actually that these islands are perhaps attracting greater pressures on them and even more people. So I just give the quick example of Venice, because recently they've had the great courage to try to change the situation there. But for a very long time, the local community was not the priority. The local residents in many ways were pushed out, and there was simply an invasion, an unmanageable invasion of tourists. I don't think this is what anyone would wish for their heritage places. So what's the solution? Now, in more recent times, the heritage sector has moved to an understanding that heritage really isn't an island. It can't be an island. Heritage places are intimately connected to their wider setting, and that includes the people who live there. So if I return to Gammini's slide, what we've seen is a shift over time. We're shifting to a recognition that we want to be aiming at the well-being of not just the heritage, but also society, both together. So what does this mean for us as heritage practitioners? We've had to adjust within these changing perspectives. Now, originally, a conventional heritage management system would have been full of a series of experts, and they knew best, we knew best, we thought we knew what was the most important things. However, over time, there's been a shift towards values-based approaches, and I include the World Heritage System here. And there's been a recognition that the heritage specialist is not the only person who might hold values. There have been others, including communities, who have complementary perspectives that we can listen to. But you'll note here that we as heritage practitioners are still largely holding the power. We might listen to others, but we still have the choice to take on board their perspectives or not. So in recent years, there's been a call for more people-centred approaches. Now, it's important to note that I am not saying that heritage practitioners don't have a role to play. We are still included in these approaches, and we have an important contribution there, but we are one of many who are contributing. I would argue that we can now show that the results of these approaches are greater for heritage and greater for those involved. So let's take that broader discussion and apply it to interpretation. Because I think many of you, if I come back to the same slide, will recognise a similar shift in the interpretation sector. On the left, we have the expert-led approaches. I think we're all familiar, even today, with a site director or a museum curator who still very happily writes a long site panel or a brochure about heritage because they want to share their knowledge. We still do have expert-led approaches in interpretation. But I'd say that by and large, what we're promoting are the more values-based approaches where we are more inclusive and we're working together with a wider range of people. I think the challenge, though, remains, as everywhere, to find genuinely people-centred approaches where we are contributing and we bring our own specialist skills, but we're not necessarily leading, because I feel there's perhaps a distrust that if we hand over power to the community, it might not work so well. So for this presentation, I'm going to be discussing these last two options, ones where we're more inclusive, and then look at perhaps examples of what might happen if we let go a little. Because if we're going to be engaging communities, we actually have to make sure that we are allowing them to participate meaningfully. And I think we need to be very careful that many so-called community projects are actually very top-down, and we're not allowing our communities to have genuine participation in projects. Now, I shared this slide regarding interpretation in World Heritage for two reasons. Now, first of all, I think those of us in interpretation, we need to fight for the fact that interpretation is actually one of the core businesses of World Heritage. It's often forgotten. Presentation and interpretation are recognised as necessary at World Heritage properties. And we should not be ashamed of that, and we can continue to fight when that's not recognised in our management systems. And I also would like to highlight another point, which is this: the interpretation for visitors. I think we need to ask ourselves some questions about who our visitors are, and therefore who exactly we're doing the interpretation for. Because in too many places, just like the example I showed you of Venice, for far too long, we have been promoting World Heritage only to international tourists, if we're honest about the broad trends in our sector. We are thinking of audiences who are coming from afar and who are unfamiliar with the heritage, and that's who we're targeting. And I don't need to go into details today, because you will all be familiar with examples where unmanaged tourism is damaging to the communities locally and also to the heritage. And yet, I think we do need to take responsibility as interpretation people for the fact that we very often supported those goals, unwillingly or not. And we need to think much more about interpretation for different audiences. I would also like to provoke a thought with this piece of research, which was trying to show comparatively experiences in different countries around the world. Now, if you see here, you'll see that my home country of Italy scores very highly, both in terms of its heritage and its tourism. But I would ask you to spot what's missing. If you look at this column on quality of life, you'll notice that Italy doesn't even appear in the list. And I think these sorts of studies should provoke us to think, despite the enormous quantity of heritage, rightly globally known about, it doesn't seem to be contributing to the well-being of its citizens. And that should leave us with a big question mark about what we're doing. Now, I borrowed this slide from the National Association for Interpretation. We have many different definitions of our work. But this is quite a useful one to provoke us, again, to think about what we're doing. If interpretation, if what we're aiming for are meaningful experiences, and we are seeking to inspire people to connect with the world around them, is this something that we only want to offer to international tourists? Or should we be, in this context, thinking that that is also something that is very important for our local communities? Now, we are, I would be wrong to say that we're not doing this entirely. Some people are doing excellent work, and I would like to point to what I think is a fantastic example of the Museum of Siam in Bangkok. In this particular case, the target audience, the main people in mind when they established the museum were Thai citizens, with an emphasis on the younger generation. And it's a fantastic, almost an interpretation centre, which meets a museum, and it thinks about the country's history and its heritage in detail, with for its own citizens to then think about their culture today and what the future might hold. But the beauty of what they've managed to achieve here is they've created a place which is successful for local people, but as a result, it's engaging as well for international visitors, because you simply cannot dumb down interpretation for local people. So the content remains high, it remains nuanced, and it means that even as a visitor, you are offered insights into culture and life in a way that was much more engaging than many places where it becomes very simplistic. So this is a case of a real win-win, when a focus on local people actually benefits even the international visitors. So I don't want to say for a minute that we're not thinking about local community, but we need to be doing it better in more places. However, I would suggest again that this is just a first step, because as we know, there are multiple ways that we can engage with local communities. We need to be working at multiple levels. And while these examples of thinking in terms of our local communities is fantastic, we can do so much more. So in some cases, it might be appropriate to be in the informed category, where we're really helping local people to understand more about their heritage. We might be involving them in the interpretation. We can go right through the spectrum to letting the community lead. And I think each of us will perhaps be in a different place on this spectrum. In some cases, there will be different, the situation might be appropriate to be at a different level, but we can reflect on where we are today and where we might want to be. So I'm going to give you now an example from my own experience and how we went on a journey across this spectrum of community involvement. So I'd like to take you today to Herculaneum, which is part of the World Heritage Property, along with Pompeii. You find it here in southern Italy on the Bay of Naples. And Herculaneum lies at the foot of Mount Vesuvius. Here we are. In AD 79, there was an enormous eruption of the volcano, and it buried the Roman town. And that is why it is World Heritage today. Both Pompeii and Herculaneum are a moment frozen in time that show that daily life in the Roman world. So if you visit today, you can walk down those ancient town streets. You can visit the houses and the shops and the bath buildings and the monuments of the Roman town. You can walk inside and enjoy the decorations. And you can actually find many of the contents that make it so incredible to get an understanding of life in the town. So things from a wooden bed on the top left, a loaf of bread, you can see a winch with a rope, and even human remains. So we have a very clear understanding of what life was like 2,000 years ago in this place. Now, in the context of a very large conservation project that's been underway at the site since 2001, there have been a lot of activities to engage a whole range of stakeholders, including the local community. Now, in the early years, there was a recognition that, as you can see in this photo, there was a local community that lived very close to the archaeological site. The modern town is right up against the ancient town, but the local residents were very much cut off from their heritage. There were not only physical barriers around the site, but there were also socio-economic issues, including the very simple problem that the ticket price was incredibly expensive for people who are suffering from real difficulties in terms of unemployment and poverty. Now, in this context, early work focused on ways to bring community groups into the site, give them that experience. Schools groups are an obvious and easy and enthusiastic audience for a lot of activities. But we also wanted to reach out also to the adults and the residents in particular. What you see on the screen is residents of a particular street, a neighbourhood directly next to the archaeological site. You can see the people living in those houses have a perfect view to the Roman town, but many of them had never actually visited. So we started with things like organising special visits, giving them insights, events, where the interpretation was specifically tailored to these members of the local community. And of course, the more you get to know people, the more you tailor your interpretation to their needs. So less emphasis, obviously, on a very long technical site panel, and using more media to really offer them interpretation that was meaningful for them. But that was perhaps just a first phase and an easy phase. The more we worked with people, the more we got to know people, we realised that in actual fact, they weren't a passive audience for our interpretation, but they were a huge resource. So I'm going to give you just a couple of examples here of the fact that we realised that the local community themselves could be the ones offering the interpretation. What you see here is actually an international course organised by ICCROM that we partnered with them when they came to Herculaneum. And the local schools not only interpreted their own heritage, but they worked with the international participants to interpret heritage from sites around the world. And the exhibition that resulted from this collaboration was placed in, it's right next to the archaeological site, but an area where you don't need a ticket. So it was open to the wider local community. And it attracted a significant number of local residents who had never visited Herculaneum before. We also ended up just simply handing over many of the visits of important delegations. In this case, you see the European Commission, who had come to Herculaneum, and we worked with, having had worked with local schools, we handed over. They led the visit entirely for our guests. And in fact, it was much more successful than anything we could have done. The fact that the children spontaneously at the end of the visit demanded support for conservation of their heritage was a more powerful message than we could ever have given ourselves. So we learned to hand over a lot of work to these poor children and others. But there was a moment then when I think we had to learn that it wasn't just that the community were our equals in interpreting Herculaneum. There was so much that we could gain from them. And this was a key moment for us. I think there was a pivotal moment when, through an oral history project, we recognised how much knowledge was held by the community themselves. So, for example, these are former site workers who had memories of the very large excavation campaign that took place in the early and mid-20th century. The conditions they had found, their working experiences were not documented in a way, in enough detail always. And we learnt their experiences of excavation, conservation, technical recipes, and even the early experiments of interpretation at the site, including displays within the Roman houses. And these workers were able to pass on their knowledge to the latest generation of archaeologists and conservators working on the site. And in addition, as we continued to work within an urban regeneration project for that local neighbourhood in 𝐕𝐚𝐺𝐻, talking again, increasingly building relationships with the local community, we realised that they had multi-generational knowledge of what it meant to live next to this heritage. They could share accounts that nobody had heard before, taking shelter in the Roman theatre during bombing in the Second World War, or hiding from foreign soldiers within the site. They shared their knowledge of the heritage outside of the Roman site. So the history of the modern town, which turned out to not always be so modern after all. And they shared the values they held, because unlike our very academic interest, perhaps, in this buried Roman town, For the local community, that archaeological site is actually also a stark warning of what might happen again one day. These are very different perspectives that should be informing our interpretation. So this experience, I think, was formative for all of us working at Herculaneum, and it challenged the way we were thinking about our work. And I wanted to understand more about how interpretation might be part of this bigger picture of heritage management. And I carried out some research where I asked these two questions. Can participatory interpretation contribute to the management and conservation of cultural heritage? And can participatory interpretation bring benefits for both communities and for heritage? Now, during this research, I looked at Herculaneum, but I also went to a nearby second heritage place, which I would also like to take you to today, to the Rione Sanità, which is a neighbourhood in Naples. So if I return to my map, you can see that Naples is quite close to Herculaneum. It's also the largest the largest city in the region. And it's also a World Heritage Property, which is recognised for its layers of history going back millennia. And the case study of Sanità is actually this neighbourhood that you can see highlighted within the property, right in the heart of the city. Now, in many ways, this is a very typical Naples neighbourhood, a lot of dense urbanism, a large population, some really significant examples of modern life living with incredible architectural heritage. And yet it's a neighbourhood that has suffered enormously, like many places in this area, huge socio-economic problems, real challenge for the people living there. And there's also lots of, let's say, lesser known heritage. For example, it's the birthplace of one of Italy's most famous actors, 𝐂𝐨𝐦𝐦𝐻𝐿. There's lots of traditions in Naples, lots of intangible heritage. But perhaps what is their greatest resource and what was recognised in recent years is a young generation full of energy and enthusiasm and no traditional opportunities in terms of employment, but the young generation that was prepared to see their heritage as something they could work with and something that was very important to them. So in this neighbourhood, a whole series of cultural activities were set up, from a youth orchestra, a local theatre group, lots of artists with art installations throughout the neighbourhood. But the thing that I'd like to focus on today is obviously the heritage and how they worked with that. Because as well as the above ground heritage, the architecture that you can see, below ground, there are a series of very important heritage places. So what you can see here are the ancient catacombs from Roman times. And under this church, if you go underneath, there are others where historic times the most important members of the community were commemorated in these catacombs. Now, for a very long time, these really significant pieces of heritage were largely neglected. What was the interesting case in Naples is that it was a young group of people who came together specifically for the heritage and formed their own association, gained their own training, and have now opened these places to the public. They are offering everything from guided tours, both to the heritage places and around the neighbourhood, special events, cultural activities that truly give life back again to these, what are incredible places, as I hope you can see from the photographs. And it's not just the interpretation directly done by the group that is important. This has in turn touched a whole range of other local groups. So another association was giving craft skills to young people, which is in itself used within the heritage for interpretive details, for visitor management purposes, for souvenirs to remind visitors of what they've seen and why the place is so special. They've also had another group of young people who were trained in very essential skills like electricians, who then were able to offer those skills to the heritage. So there's been a whole series of groups that have come around the heritage to make it more functioning and more enjoyable. And as a result, if you go today, and I would encourage you all to go, there's a whole series of activities and excellent interpretation around the neighbourhood and its wealth of heritage resources. And I will just add another little additional chapter to their story, because over the years, the success of what they were doing caused them to think about another heritage place in their neighbourhood, this time a heritage place which had been closed for a very long time. Now, this is a historic cemetery. The human remains are here due to a series of moments hundreds of years ago where plague hit Naples. There was the need for a large cemetery area. But the traditions in Naples, the intangible heritage linked to these human remains, means that there are very significant spiritual practices. Local residents will adopt a skull and form a special relationship with them, caring for them. But this had been shut down. The local authorities had decided that this was not appropriate and could no longer be done. And at a certain point, the entire cemetery was closed. Now, thanks to the success of the young people running, managing and interpreting the catacombs, which were considered to be appropriate heritage, they were able to come and negotiate with the authorities over this cemetery. And it was because of their success, with their all of the work they'd done, which largely based on interpretation, that the authorities recognised that they could trust the community to take back this cemetery as well. So if you visit today, this is now open to the public again. It's open to the local residents who want to go to visit and to pay their respects to the dead again. And visitors can also be guided round by local guides, giving their very unique perspective of what is a long forgotten heritage tradition. As you can see from the data that they themselves have collected, these community efforts have been a huge success in terms of providing meaningful visits, in terms of creating local jobs, and in terms of taking back heritage that had been either neglected or closed. So my research wanted to understand how their approach to interpretation had contributed to that bigger picture. Now, I don't expect you to read the details of this table, but what I want you to understand is the conclusion I drew. I based my research on identifying the heritage values, the full range that can be seen here in Naples, and then looking at the interpretation of those values. Now, when I looked at the official interpretation, very often the heritage values were not recognised, and that's what you can see in red. There were a lot of areas which official interpretation simply ignored or didn't know about. Instead, when I looked at the community-led interpretation, both at Herculaneum and in Naples, the green that you can see here is a sign of how much richer their interpretation was. It drew on greater knowledge, and that seemed to be the source of success. So when I return with you to my original research questions, so can participatory interpretation contribute to the management and conservation of cultural heritage? Well, I concluded yes, because the very act of consulting a wider range of stakeholders when doing interpretive planning, that results in identifying more values and even in some cases, attributes of heritage, things that had simply been forgotten, were identified. And that in itself is the basis for better management. We can't manage things we don't know about. And can participatory interpretation bring benefits for communities and heritage? Well, that for me was a clear yes. And let me in my final slides explain why. Again, I'm not expecting you to read the details. What I'd like you to get the impression of is the fact that I was able to identify so many benefits. There were benefits to this community approach to the visitors. There were clear benefits to the communities themselves. There were also benefits for us as heritage practitioners, and that suggests perhaps we should be much more open to such approaches. And significantly, there were a large number of benefits for the heritage itself. And that is where I think we need to also really take confidence that there were benefits in terms of heritage conservation, protection, and giving it a meaningful role in society today. So my research concluded that there was quite clear evidence that community-led interpretation not only has the potential to make better visitor experiences, but actually, if we want to embrace it, we could contribute to a whole range of much bigger agendas. We could be contributing to genuine sustainable development and much better heritage management. So I come back from interpretation to that wider heritage discourse for a moment, because I think my conclusions very much echoed what is being said more broadly. And indeed, if you don't agree with me, there is someone here on the screen much more important than me who thinks this, that we need to get better at tapping into community contributions, because quite frankly, we don't really have much of a choice anymore. The amount of heritage that we are trying to care for is beyond the resources that are available. So my final reflection before I close today would be this. There would seem to be clear benefits to community involvement in heritage interpretation. And as I said at the beginning, my case is just one case, and I'm hoping that you all have your own experiences to share on this as well. So if there are these benefits and we want to gain them, we need to stop thinking about working with communities, and we need to stop thinking about doing interpretation as just the cherry on the cake. It cannot just be that last detail that we add if we have the time and if we have the energy after we have done everything else. Because if you look very carefully at the cake, you'll actually notice that those cherries are within the cake itself. They're one of the core ingredients. We're not going to gain the successes and the benefits that we want if we're not recognizing communities and interpretation as a core ingredient of heritage management. And I think that's what we want to be aiming for in all of our work. So on that final thought, I would like to thank you all for listening, and hopefully you've got lots of your own comments and questions too. Thank you all.
Thank you. Oops. I better lower it down. Thank you, Dr. Sarah-Court. Thank you for your insightful lecture on World Heritage interpretation and presentation, and especially on the engagement, the involvement of local communities. Listening to your studies and researches, especially with the example about the Herculaneum sites, were really interesting, because quite a lot of sites, there are local communities who live right next to the sites, but who've never been to sites, or who feels a little bit stressful about the entrance fee, because it is too expensive for the local communities to enter it. So it was a great opportunity to listen to your researches and the case of the Herculaneum sites. And thank you for your wonderful lecture. And as we always did, If you have any questions for the lecture and World Heritage issues, please leave comments on our YouTube and Facebook's live streaming video. And once again, Sarah, I highly appreciate you for your inspiring lecture with your researches. And I really like the expression at the very end of your speech today. I totally agree with your opinion that local communities should not be the very end that is decorating the management or the interpretation process of World Heritage sites, but local communities should be involved as a core of the management of of World Heritage sites. Well, before we enter public's Q&A session, I'd like to ask. Are there any nice examples you can share with us about the site that is making high involvement of local communities?
Yeah, I think there are increasing numbers today where local communities are being given significant roles. We see a lot of guiding in many sites where local people who are taking visitors around their town or their landscape. So I think this isn't something that is unique to any particular one place, but I don't think it's as common as we would like to see it. I think this is an important thing. We're not suggesting a revolution that should be terrifying to our heritage managers, because these examples are quite widespread, but they are always in the minority. But I think, again, I've seen some very interesting cases where it was important for the local community. For example, in Australia, where there are sacred landscapes, the community can carry out the guiding very well, not just because of their knowledge, but when it's not appropriate to have visitors go to everywhere. And I think that's an example where lots of different spiritual or religious places could learn that we can manage our visitors well or better when we allow the community to help us do that. So I think this is something that we're seeing in all regions of the world now, some very strong cases.
Thank you for your answer. And yeah, in the case you shared during your speech, such as the Pompeii sites, really, local communities knows a lot more histories and stories that was occurred or the sites have. So I think we also believe that it is really important and precious to listen to local communities. And well, maybe we can start today's Q&A session now. There is our first question from Hyungyung Lee on our Facebook. So I will read out our first question. The question was, thanks indeed for your thought-provoking presentation. Could you please give us any advice on how to apply different opinions from experts groups and community groups to heritage interpretation?
Thank you. This is a good question, because I think it's useful for us to reflect on when we have differences in opinion between so-called experts and the community groups. This is usually when we are agreeing or disagreeing on what is most important. Very often we find that heritage specialists are very focused on the big academic stories related to our places, or they would like to tell a very clean and tidy story. And I think this is perhaps a problem from the way we have all been trained. A lot of heritage interpretation training tells us that we have to have a very organized structure to interpretation, and we have to have key messages, and you choose the most important one, and then you divide this into your sub-themes and topics, and interpretive planning can be very rigid. Now, I'm not suggesting that there isn't some benefits to being disciplined, because if we're communicating with many people who are visiting our sites from all over the world, we do well to offer clear messages. But I do think sometimes I've seen communities who they don't like that, the rigidity, because it doesn't tell the story of the place. And I think my research showed that in actual fact, the richness of many stories was more successful. And it was actually of greater interest to the visitor, who didn't necessarily want neat and tidy interpretation. They wanted to experience all of the culture, and that sometimes is untidy and energetic and creative. And so I think that's often where these differences of opinions come from, when we as professionals want to be too organized. And I think if we could relax for a minute, we can help make suggestions and we can help offer an outside perspective, but we're not always right. So I think if I was going to give some advice on how to bring these two different perspectives together, it would be that we should sometimes have the humility to let go of our way of doing things and experiment with more creative ways.
Right, thank you for your answer. And well, here's our second question. Well, actually, our public participants are leaving lots of questions today too, so I will read out our second question. The second question was left by Asmara Ajat, and the question was how to develop work with communities, where to start.
Because I don't think there is one recipe, unfortunately, that fits all situations. There are different communities in different situations, and I think we should also recognise there are situations where communities don't necessarily want to be actively involved, or rather they might have other priorities. I know that some of our work has had to recognise that community members are sometimes very busy simply trying to go about their normal life with a job to provide for their families. They might not always have the extra time to come and help us with what is for us paid work. However, in most cases, I think there are always situations where the community is proud of their heritage, and if they have the possibility to contribute, they will. It is a case of finding those people. I think in a lot of cases, we can actually look for existing strengths, because very often, even when there's a very successful, very visited World Heritage property with an official management system and official interpretation, you will often find local associations which already exist and are already working actively. And local schools are always a source of huge amounts of projects. So already starting with existing strengths and recognising that means that you can already partner with groups. Sometimes they're not always working with heritage as we would recognise it, but every community has positive things they can bring. So I think if we're genuinely wanting to start to work with communities, we work with them in the ways that they're already going, and then you can start the conversation about whether we could work together for the heritage and take things forward as part of a bigger conversation.
Great, thank you for your answer. And there's our third question. I will read out our next question. The next question was left by Pablo Arturo Lopez Guillose. The question was, I have worked with sites in Mexico. The knowledge of the local communities don't necessarily resonate with the Western academic knowledge. How can we reconcile this to engage local communities?
Yes, and this is not just a problem in Mexico. This is a problem in many places. I think this starts again with us. I think many of the problems we are facing, the problems come from our sector. And I think here I would love to encourage people to regain their sense of curiosity about the world. I think we don't admit this because we're all busy being important, academics or professionals, But we are all working in heritage because there is something very special about heritage. These special places are exciting and interesting, and we're not often allowed to talk about it with emotion, but that's why we do our jobs, because the world is an amazing place. When we remind ourselves of that and our curiosity, we're in a much better way to go and talk to communities who don't have academic knowledge, but have knowledge about the heritage place, about their place, which is fascinating. If we stop coming from our perspective, we'll be able to tap into that. So I think we need to come with a bit of humility to what is interesting and not interesting, and what is important and not important, and remind ourselves that the world genuinely is amazing and that people can help us know that. And I think we also have to go into these conversations perhaps recognizing that communities don't understand ours because we speak a different language, and I'm not talking about English or, in this case, Spanish. It is because we have our way of doing things, and they won't understand why we're asking certain questions, and they don't understand how we often only take on board contributions if they're in a certain format. So sometimes just explaining ourselves and remembering that there is a cultural divide that is not cultural in the normal sense. It's between the heritage sector as a culture and our institutional cultures, which people don't understand, and we need to just be able to cross those cultural divides. And again, it comes down to just reconnecting, I think, with people. And it should be very simple, but it's not always. So I think that in some way answers the question.
Thank you for your answer. And well, there are really lots of questions, and there is our next question. Our next question was left by Vivian. The question is, do you have any example of local community which disconnected religiously, even have negative feeling to the heritage? How the places solve the problem?
Yeah, this isn't easy because there are, I think, we're in danger of going into the direction of things like contested heritage, where there can be very strong negative feelings on religious basis towards heritage, which is a much bigger subject than we have time to deal with today. In fact, that could be a whole nother lecture series. In those very big, strong situations, I think everybody would love to know how to solve it, and I would not be the expert on peace building. However, we do have, let's say, less extreme cases where I think we can contribute. And in many cases of religious heritage, I think we have often got disconnects, again, because of the way we have perhaps managed religious and sacred places in the past. There are so many examples. I think, for example, there's been some really interesting cases of where sacred sites in Africa, like painted caves, the community has been kept away and they weren't allowed to do their rituals anymore. And the management practices of taking them away from their heritage and the consequences of those actions meant that the community went back and actively tried to destroy the heritage, to damage it. And those negative problems are caused by our actions. But I see in many different contexts, even in churches, where the community has not been allowed to use candles for their prayers because the candles might damage the wall paintings in the churches. I think there are a series of problems where we have created the disconnect and the anger and the frustration by stopping communities from carrying out their practices. And the places were created by communities for those practices, and then we say no. And I think sometimes we might, again, need the humility to recognise that it might not be our position to say no. And if we have concerns about conservation issues, we need to go with humility and discuss them. Because in all these cases, when there is a religious community, they're attached to the place, they believe it's special themselves. So once you start the conversation on that basis of mutual respect and a great passion for the place, you start the conversation well then about conservation, and solutions can be found. So although I don't have solutions, as I say, to those major religious conflicts, I think very often we need to be much more sensitive with living heritage places and religious places in particular.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. Yeah, it would be great if we can eventually find the peaceful solution for all the conflicts or the issues we are facing nowadays on World Heritage Sites. Well, there's our next question, so I will read it out. The question was left by Sheena. The question is, involving the community is highly beneficial, but it also involves a highly active and willing participating community. When it comes to heritage protection, particularly in developing countries, it can be the case that community will may differ from the direction heritage experts may want to proceed, especially in terms of heritage protection and development. Then, how would you suggest resolving this kind of tension?
Yes, again, these aren't easy questions, and oh gosh, these are very big questions for presentation and interpretation. But I think what we're seeing in these big cases where a community might want to go into a different direction, I think for many years, our solution was not to discuss with communities at all. When we were talking about development and sustainable development, for a long time there was a nervousness in the heritage sector about being part of those conversations, because there is a great deal of fear and very often real cases where heritage has suffered from development. Ignoring the question doesn't help, because the development happens anyway. So I think it is at least now recognised that we need to be part of those conversations, and they are difficult. But I think actually the very process of having the conversation is useful, because again, I think we underestimate communities when we suggest they don't understand how important heritage is. These are usually their places, and they will want, in most cases, people want a better world for themselves and their children. So when we manage to have the conversation and explain what the implications are of certain actions, we're already halfway to a solution. It doesn't always mean an easy resolution, but I think we have to stop avoiding the conversations and start having them. And particularly in cases where people are really wanting to get out of poverty, heritage should not be seen as an obstacle. And I think we have a responsibility to show them the way that heritage can be part of the solution, and maybe start offering alternatives. Now that's very difficult for us, because none of us were usually trained for that sort of work, and I think that's where we feel most uncomfortable. But perhaps that's a new generation of heritage people who need to, a new generation in our sector that needs to come and see heritage as part of society, so that when there is an option being offered to a community about how to develop, we can perhaps show there's alternatives, and those we would hopefully always be going not for the heritage only option or the development only option, but I think there's always the third way, and we need to be able to offer those third ways to communities, and I think most of the time we would then find that people would go for it, because if they're in developing countries and wanting a brighter future for their country, that's only to be supported. It's perhaps the way we go in that direction that is important. So I don't think there's a one recipe. There's never a single recipe for every situation, but I think there are approaches which we can always try to adopt. And I think those respectful conversations and creative problem solving, which are at the heart of trying to resolve these kinds of tensions.
Thank you for your answer. And yes, It is always difficult to find the third way between the development and the conservation of heritage sites, but it will be really wonderful if we can find a peaceful third way, which is helpful for all the people, including local communities, and for the heritage sites too. And well, thank you for your answer once again. And I think the next question will be our last question for today. Well, I will read out the question, which is left by 𝐂𝐨𝐦𝐦𝐻𝐿𝐴. The question is, I fully agree with you. However, it is difficult to get a consensus result that 100% satisfies everyone. So where should the final result of the interpretation be aimed? Ooh.
Yes. In fact, the experience of being a human being is that we will never have 100% of people happy.
Yeah.
So, sadly, I would like to make everyone happy, but it's not possible. So, yes, another good question. So where should we be aiming our interpretation? I think, again, this is a question which it depends on context. If in some cases, it might be as simple as saying, we want to satisfy the greatest number of people possible, and we're democratic about it. However, I do think there are cases where not all our opinions are equal, not all stakeholders are equal. In some cases, actually, it's the local community, or it might be the religious community, the core group which is attached to that heritage, who should have the final say. I think that is, in some cases, we need to be really clear that sometimes they get to decide. And that's just the way it should be with many pieces of heritage. We need to stop thinking that we can decide everything. And again, we should recognize that we can't make everybody happy, but maybe that's not always a problem with interpretation. If we've identified who we want to come, and our interpretation is tied into management aims, and we're supporting good management and good conservation, and if we manage to do all of those things, then that's good interpretation. And I don't think we need to necessarily measure interpretation by 100% of people want to come to our site, because we've got bigger things in mind than keeping everyone happy. So I think maybe that's a controversial answer, but I hope it in some way answers.
Well, thank you for your answer. And well, I've told you that it might be our last question, but actually we had another question, so maybe can we have another one? Would that be okay? Yeah, thank you. Thank you for understanding. Well, there's our next question. The question is, the 40th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention in Kyoto meeting in 2012 has stressed the community involvement in heritage protection and sustainable development. Facing the 50th anniversary next year, do you think the community value has well reflected in the convention for the last 10 years? And what do you think the gist of the 50th anniversary of the convention?
I like this. Obviously, I thought we were speaking on a nice, circumscribed subject today, but all of you have been inspired to ask big questions. Yes, it is very interesting that these big themes in World Heritage, which obviously do always come out in our interpretation work, where do we go next? Indeed, the community emphasis for the last anniversary was really important. I think that it was something that was lacking. The original convention perhaps didn't put enough importance on community role. So it's fantastic we've put that emphasis there. I still think we've perhaps got a long way to go. We've not yet resolved all our problems with community engagement, even though we're getting better. And there's increasing amounts of work done to make sure communities are involved from the minute a nomination is being thought of. But each place and each country is having its own struggles of how to put that within the heritage sector. So that is the challenge. We have institutions and we have legal frameworks, and none of these necessarily were created with a community involvement in mind. So it's still a challenge. I think we need to still keep going. But what to do for the next 50th anniversary? Well, there's a big question. I think I'd like to leave that to all of the people who are still listening today. You can put your own suggestions in the chat, because I think that's a bigger question than me.
Yeah, it is really a big question, and it would be great if we can, if there can be a bigger involvement of local communities in the next 10 years. I mean, after the 50th anniversary next year, and I'm sure lots of experts will put a lot of effort on involving communities' stories on heritage interpretation and presentation too. Well, before we end today's lecture, and Doctor, would you like to say something or your last word to our public participants today?
I'd just like to thank you all for your interest in this area. I think it's genuinely important, and I look forward to reading all the comments in the chat and your own experiences in the future. I think this is an area where we can all really learn from each other. So thank you again.
Thank you for your inspiring and insightful lecture today. And once again, highly appreciate you for joining this year's online lecture series. Now, yes. And now, before we end today's event, I'd like to introduce our next lecture, which will be held on next month. Yes, the next lecture, Heritage and Participatory Media in the Age of Data Technology, with Professor 𝐂𝐨𝐦𝐦𝐿, will be held on 14th October. Well, actually, the time of the lecture is not exactly decided yet, so further information on the lecture, including the exact time of it, will be informed on our Facebook and Instagram. Thanks again for joining us today, and I hope to see you again next month. Thank you.